we say we want to fish, but we don't like their smell. Like we don't like how they look like, how they dress, how they talk, what they think about. And we have to learn to love the fish.
Welcome to This Strange Land with Jason Jensen. Join the conversation with other courageous ministry leaders as we explore what it means to serve the church in a rapidly changing and unfamiliar world. Discover insight, wisdom, and inspiration as you live out your ministry calling in this strange land.
Welcome. Today I'm with Father George Elsbett. He is a priest at the John Paul II Center in Vienna, and I'm really excited to have you on the show. And a lot of how I think about and what's made me very curious about what's happening on your side of the world is I think of you as a priest from the future, or a priest that is learning to navigate a future that our culture here in North America seems to be moving towards. And different places within Canada and the US are at different sort of spots within that place of a move from Christendom to a very secular society. And in the midst of all that in Vienna, we have you as a thriving little community of faith that's growing and attracting the imagination of young people in particular. And I just want to paint a story for those who may not be familiar with your situation, and I'd love for you to be able to expand on it. But my brother-in-law used to work in Munich. He's of German. He's German. Used to be in Munich, and one of his friends, actually, when I went to meet with them, she was telling me that she had just renounced her faith formally. Grew up Catholic, and there was a point where at confirmation, the debate in her mind was, should I or shouldn't I get confirmed? But not because she believed or didn't believe. It was because, am I being true to myself, or should I wait till the presence that I could get at confirmation, surrounded by this sort of small C culture of, what confirmation was in a very, historically Catholic city like Munich. And that blew my mind to hear somebody saying, well, I don't want to end up paying state taxes. So they renounced their faith because they just did not believe that the church was real. And I think that story here in North America, like you don't hear people renouncing their faith. You don't hear that sort of approach to the world. But tell me, and tell the listeners a little bit more about what it's like in Vienna, like what the surrounding culture that you find yourself in is like.
Well, exteriorly, you still see a lot of vestiges of Christianity. First, that starts with just these beautiful churches that we have. There's tons of them, and it's been a problem for the church quite a while, because there was the Enlightenment, the Austrian version of the Enlightenment was called Josephinism, and it's after an emperor who was called he was called Joseph, and he basically had his movement away from Rome, and he was determining everything, how many candles you could have on the altar, and who could preach and who couldn't, and so on. And among other things, they made civil servants out of the parish priests, and so instead of going to your local city council or whatever to get your papers, you would go to the parish to do it. And in order to do that, they built tons of churches, which was a problem back then, never mind now, where you have a lot less practicing. So you have a lot of beautiful churches. For example, I'm in the middle of town, so right downtown Vienna, and we probably have about 100 Sunday masses within 30-minute walking distance. So you can say on the one hand, you have how many masses? But that sounds like a very flourishing Catholicism and Christianity. It sounds awesome. And the thing is, yes, on the one hand, it sounds like it. But on the other hand, we have, in the whole country, 94% of Catholics no longer practice their faith, but that's along all demographics and all geographical areas. So once you hit the cities, that statistic goes down. And once you look at young people, that goes down even further. So there's no exact numbers, but once it's estimated that the number of Catholics that are still sticking around, still paying their church taxes. That in other words, they haven't yet apostatized, or they haven't yet left the church officially in order not to pay those taxes, is somewhere around 1% that are under 35 years old. And that's pretty amazing. For example, in Germany, Germany is doing a bit worse than Austria. So they're 2% worse. They're 96% no longer practice their faith. But among the Lutheran and the Catholic Church last year, more than 600,000 people actually made that step of leaving the church officially, signing that piece of paper saying, I am no longer a Catholic. So that statistic that I'm talking about doesn't include those numbers. And so really it's a lot worse than one would think. And then you think, well, you got way too many priests. Well, it all depends on your perspective. Like, first of all, they're all old. And second of all, like a few years ago when we started our process of saying we have to do things differently, I tried to make the calculation and I figured, okay, well, we have about one priest for about every 28 people still going to Mass in this city. So it looks like you have tons of priests, but everybody's complaining about priest shortage because for the amount of churches we have way too few priests. And it's, there is a big shortage. So it all kind of depends on your perspective, because if you see, well, is our mission to reach the people that are in the pews? Then yes, we have way too many priests. If our mission is to reach the people that aren't in the pews, well, we have too few priests. And above all, we have way too few practicing Catholics that are on fire for mission and for the, So that's one thing. That's just on the part of practicing. On top of that, because I think for North Americans, this is so hard to understand. Like you have these beautiful churches, but it's that whole system of church tax was introduced by Hitler, and it's so difficult to change it now because the whole society structure is so much interwoven. So, for example, looking again at the German example, the Caritas, which is our version of the Catholic Social Relief Services in Germany, has 400,000 employees, which is the biggest employer after the state. And so the church, through that service, for example, is running hospitals, it's running old folks' homes, it's running the centers for drug addicts. I mean, there's a lot of good things happening, which and it is. So it's hard to take that. If you would no longer pay those church taxes, those things wouldn't all be possible anymore. On the other hand, you have some situations, and this is no different between Catholic Church and the Protestants, and above all Lutherans in Germany, for example. There is a Lutheran diocese in Germany that has more employees than people going to church on Sunday, wow, which is insane. Right? You don't know if to laugh or to cry. A lot of times that's kind of that's part of the problematic that we're faced with. We have this kind of weird historical heritage. In this country, in Germany, the state gathers in those taxes for the church, gives it back to the bishops. In this country, the church itself, by law, has to gather in those taxes. So the first letter that somebody gets when he moves to a new place for example, in a city, myself, it happened to me, even though I'm a religious priest and I don't, I have a vow of poverty. The first letter that I get from the local church coming to this place was a letter from the church asking me to pay my church taxes. And it's like not the most welcoming thing, right? But so that even that law is not very much in favor of the church. It's kind of actually quite anti-clerical because it doesn't. The state forces the church to keep up these buildings in a pristine state, and they're beautiful. Again, I'm not denigrating that, but it's they're all historical buildings. They're all under heritage site considerations. Costs tons of money to keep them up. And then you have these weird things happening, like, for example, sometimes you can't heat the church because you could hurt the artwork, and then, but the only thing you want to do after Mass on a Sunday is go home and have a hot cup of tea. There's no possibility of trying to create community, so that you have all these kind of weird problems. Like there was a group of Americans here a while, like last year, and they were doing a tour of Vienna, and they asked me to kind of go along with them. And I remember we were after a dinner, somebody showed them this beautiful little Baroque chapel, and they were, I mean, literally, I kid you not, I mean, they walked into this church and they were like, they were almost drooling. I mean, not exaggerating a bit maybe, but like it was so, because it's such a beautiful place. And I was just thinking, I could show you another 250 of these buildings. They're even a lot more beautiful in this city. And it's like, sometimes there's almost this romantic view of give us some of these beautiful buildings and some of that exterior form, and that's good over here in North America, and we're going to have the faith back. Like it's almost as if we just need to go back to that and everything will be fine. And I'm saying, well, that's not our situation. Like people have said, like, we don't want anything to do with that. Like, and maybe you'll go to that out of cultural reasons or whatever, but yeah, I'm sure there's tons of people here in the city that have never gone into St. Stephen's Cathedral, even though it's one of the most spectacular Gothic cathedrals that you can think of. And I mean, there's tons of tourists that go through it every day. Yeah, so it's kind of this weird situation, of there is a cultural heritage of Catholicism in this country, which is historically Catholic, right? Because this was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which were the Habsburgs. It was Catholic in name. Even it had these kind of Enlightenment emperors, and for example, one of these emperors, one I was mentioning, he disbanded about, I think, 800 monasteries in the empire, and he said all these people, they have to do something meaningful with their lives. They should go into parishes and not be praying in monasteries, and so you have all these kind of interesting historical thing that's happening here. Some of it good, some of it not so good. But the point being that historical church, that here you have a term, it's called Volkskirche, the church of the people. I'll give you another example of where this was, where I realized what this must have been like before. There was a group of friends, they were doing a mission in the Ukraine, and they were in Eastern Slovak Republic. And Slovak Republic is formerly communist, and Austria was not part of that communist bloc, so it's part of the Western Europe. So all of these Eastern countries, they have a very different dynamic than Western Europe. Like Czech, and each one is so different. Like Czech Republic and Slovak Republic used to be one country during communist times. It was called Czechoslovakia. The Czech part is, and it depends where in Czech part, but it's one of the most atheistic countries in Europe. It has, I think, more than 60% atheists. And Slovak Republic is one of the most Catholic countries in Europe. They have a higher percentage of vocations per capita than Poland does. And so the eastern part, and the capital of Slovak Republic it's a 50-minute car drive away from where I'm seated right now in downtown Vienna. So, they used to call them the Twin Cities, but it's a totally different world. And so the western part of Slovak Republic is becoming more secular, but the eastern part is still extremely Catholic. And so our missionaries went to mass here on the way to the Ukraine in the eastern part of Slovak Republic, and they asked the priest what's the percentage of practicing Catholics? And he didn't understand the question. He said, "What do you mean? Like, well, how many people go to mass on Sunday here?" What? And he said, "Well, everybody." And that was like the Volkskirche, the time of the church of the people. It was just the thing you did. Like you just went to church. That was, maybe it wasn't always because you were the most profound and deep Catholic, but it was also a very strong cultural thing, identity that you did. And that church, that way of doing church, is just totally broken away. And the North American explanation of that, or like I've seen that in Monsignor Shea's book, right? He talks about that, From Christendom to Apostolic Age. And he talks about this Christendom time. This Christendom time in Austria is just gone. Like it's totally gone. And that's a huge challenge for all of us involved in evangelization. For example, myself as a priest, none of us were trained to work outside of a Christendom model. We're all trained to work in this model where you presuppose that people come into the church and you're kind of managing things that are happening. So you're trying to see that you have good catechesis, that you have exciting youth programs, that people are getting their marriage prep, that you're doing good preaching, but it's all presupposing that people are actually still showing up, and nobody is trained to reach people that aren't around. And so I think, we have a situation in Western Europe which is much more pre-Constantinian than anything we've had in the last 1,700 years. Very much oversimplifying. Obviously, there was challenging times in history, but so all of that presents quite a challenge, right? And on top of that, the laws of the country and the secularism that's going on, and there's this kind of this. It's very strange. Like when I go to North America, I've been there several times now, or the last few years, because we're doing fundraising we're building a lot bigger building, and we're trying to see if, my argument has been, like, why should a North American give money to a church in downtown Vienna, one of the richest cities in the world, with the highest standard quality of living? And I said, well, you're right, but they're all pagans. And, like, we brought the faith to you a few hundred years ago. Maybe, like, can you help us with our dying mother, So, but I'm always impressed when I go, because especially in the United States, like, people are so respectful, and there's almost this kind of like high father, and there's this, even if they're not Catholic, there's almost this kind of respect for the priest, which is also dangerous, because I think it's dangerous to put priests on a pedestal. I think a lot of the abuse scandals that, there's that problem.
The risk of clericalism and things like that. Yeah, for sure.
But there is a beauty also in that kind of that understanding of the priest, and that's just gone here. It just none of that. And so I'm always almost shocked, like even the customs people, just the way they treat you, or the way that people will talk to you when you rent a car, like I'm just not used to that. So yeah.
So I mean, as you say this, I read the Old Testament with one of my kids this last summer, and one of the stories that kind of stood out was this, a little bit of a throwaway line, and I might be misquoting here, but I think it's King Josiah, which is one of the good kings, after, David, which there weren't very many good kings, as you kind of read through that lineage. But one of the things he did was he took Moses' staff that had the serpent on it, and people were worshiping it, and so he destroyed it. And it seems like that when you talked about like, hey, we can't heat the buildings because it'll ruin the artwork, that story kind of came to mind. But one of the things that I'm fascinated with is, how did you make it through that culture? Like where did the Lord meet you in all of these things to bring you to the place that you are right now?
So I have German parents. Actually, my dad's from Munich, mom's from Nuremberg, and I was born in London, in Great Britain, while my parents were actually fleeing from the Interpol. They were fleeing from the international police. Dad was an art dealer, and mom was a young artist trying to figure out things, I guess. And at the time, she was an atheist, a very convinced atheist. She would never go into a church out of principle. So it's very ironic that her son is a priest today. And so they were the day before I was born, they were in Paris. The next day after I was born, they wanted to be in Stockholm. And so they would not stick around more than one day in one country at the end of their, like, they were constantly on the go. And so actually, I'll maybe briefly explain what happened at my birth, just because give some context. And so when Dad loved soccer. And so there was a soccer game between Germany and Great Britain in Wembley Stadium. And when he came back from the game, to the hotel, Mom was giving birth to me, so he rushed her off to St. George's Hospital. I'm called George because of that. And then he realized he had a problem because, there's we're fleeing from the police. There's a baby now, and we have a dog, and so this is probably not going to go on forever. So his last heroic action for his girlfriend, because they weren't married or anything, was that he said, okay, well, what do I do so she's not left without money? And so he invented a story that supposedly I was born during the second goal of the Germans against the British in Wembley Stadium, and that I had free entrance my whole life in the stadium because of that. And he sold it to the press. And I don't know how you can sell something like that or why anybody would buy it or even believe it. But they did. And so we have all these daily newspapers, from British newspaper articles and German newspaper articles, talking about the Wembley baby. And to make it more credible, that's what they called me. So my second name is Wembley. First name is after, like George after the hospital. So I'm George Wembley. And then Sven, I don't know if it has something to do with the fact he wanted to be in Stockholm the next day. And so and then my dad just waited in the hospital for the police to come. Like that was, he knew. Well, they knew then obviously where he was, and so he got extradited to Germany. He ended up getting an eight-year prison sentence, and Mom at that point realized, okay, this was all true, because she had kind of thought, that he was. It's a complicated story. I'm not going too much into the details, but and I'm not. I don't have any, like, there was a lot of things why my father was the way he was, and I don't want to put him down. Like, I don't have any grudges against him or anything, but that's kind of the story. And then Mom, 4 years later, like, she kind of separated ways, and 4 years later she had a spectacular conversion experience walking by a church with the Eucharist. And so somehow she wandered into this place. She had never gone into church out of principle, but there was the Blessed Sacrament was exposed, and she had she's an artist, and she tried to make a painting of what happened once, but basically a mystical experience with the Eucharist. And like, when she tells the story, it's as she said, like, it's as if every cell in my body knew that was my God. And when she tells it 40 years later, it's as if it happened this morning. It's really impressive. And ever since, she was, most of her life, she did like 3 or 4 hours of adoration every day. And ever since that. And so it's quite impressive for me as her son, because, like you say, well, what happened in those seconds or minutes or whatever it was that had that kind of an impact, and not just for like a couple of weeks and then it was gone again. And so I ended up growing up with a mother who was very convinced of her faith. After that, like, she was on fire, like, for, everything Mom did was always like 120%. When she was 18, she went the first time to Canada to look for gold. For a year in British Columbia with a faltboat, which is this kind of kayak you can put together you fold it together like a tent, you put it back. This is in the 60s, 1960s. So she went with a ship to Halifax and went with a train to British Columbia, and 18 years old, like, looking for gold for a year. Why? Because the South Seas were too far for her dad. Like, she wanted to paddle from Hamburg to Sri Lanka to look for gold there. And he basically told her, "You're crazy, young woman, you're not doing that." And then somehow she convinced him to go to Canada. And she's very, she always did everything kind of, so when she became a Catholic, she was also like 150%. And I'm sure that had an expression on me. And so I ended up growing up, like, my mom ended up getting to know a Canadian farmer from Alberta, Canada. And so I ended up moving to Canada when I was 8 years old. I was there until I was basically, I went to school in some places in the United States, boarding schools, for a while as a teen, but I was basically in Canada until I was 18. And then I did some studies of philosophy and theology in the States, and then ended up joining the Legionaries of Christ. I'm with the Order of the Legionaries of Christ in 1993, so a long time ago. But I entered in Germany because they were just starting their German novitiate, and I've never left Europe since. Like, I've been working. I did all my training in Europe. So I was in Cologne, then I was in Salamanca in Spain, I was in Rome and Italy for 5 years. Then they sent me back to Germany to do some practical work as a brother. Like, we do our practical training. We have this internship kind of thing before we become priests. And then I went back to Rome, and then basically almost immediately after ordination, there was some kind of a need of our order in Washington, and the guy who was working in Vienna had to go to Washington, and I was just happened to be the closest guy, I guess, and it just sent me to Vienna. And we make the joke that they kind of forgot that I'm here, so yeah, that's all of my priesthood has really been in Vienna, Austria. We had a whole crisis as a congregation back in 2006, and that whole process, although it didn't strike us so much. Our founder had very little to do with the foundation of things in Northern Europe. So and our provincial was very good in he had a how shall I say he was very transparent in his communication when that whole crisis hit, and that just helped a lot to create confidence. And at the end of the day, none of the German priests actually left. It was in the United States we lost 100 priests, so it was
right.
There was quite a and I think it had a lot to do with the transparency, but also maybe because the Germans, because of the history, Second World War, we put somebody back then on the pedestal. And we had kind of a bad experience with that as Germans, with good old Adolf. And so we were always very hesitant about putting our founder too much on a pedestal. And it was always, these Latin Americans, they make him a saint before. We would quote the Pope instead of the founder. And so I think that was one of the reasons why maybe the crisis didn't hit us as hard. But obviously there was a lot of things in our culture that had to change. There was all of that happening. But in a certain sense, like we would joke, people would joke about our little community in Vienna because they would call it the Wild East, because we're pretty far east in Europe. We're 200 kilometers east of Prague. And so, it's Austria is quite far east as far as Western Europe is concerned. Right. And there was just a lot of different experiences that started happening here that influenced me personally. I'm kind of going all over the place, but maybe I think where I'm like one of the things that helped, we tried a lot of different things. So we were trying to copy paste and I was the only, we were a really small foundation. So I was here with one other person, a brother in formation, and we had a priest and a brother working in Budapest and a priest and a brother working in Western Germany, and we were forming one community of 6. So it was kind of, we were really the only 2 here in Vienna, and we were trying to copy paste what we did elsewhere in the world, and it just wasn't working. And then people would quote Mother Teresa to me and say, God has asked us to be faithful, but not to be successful. And I was just, over the years, I started thinking, we had 3 dysfunctional small groups after 10 years of work. And I was just saying, yeah, maybe, but that lady had a lot of fruit for the kingdom of God, like Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I mean, it wasn't just that she just said, yes, she tried to be faithful to Jesus, but I couldn't imagine that God was asking us to have zero fruit year after year after year after year. It was, I don't want to be unfair to God because there were some nice pastoral experiences, but at the end of the day, to be very honest, we had one failure after the other. Now, one shouldn't think though that had just to do with us because we were legionaries. Like in the year I got really frustrated was 2012. Our dean of our area of the city, who was a very good priest, very faithful, Polish priest, Polish background, he had one first communion that year.
Wow.
One first communion. And that person didn't even come from his parish. Some people sent them from another parish. And so, it was just a situation of our it's a very secular context. And so we were just thinking, okay, well, either I go back to Canada feeding cows or something, or because something has to change. And that's what started me on a personal pathway. The first decision I made was to pray more. So I made the decision I'm going to spend an extra time of adoration every day. We already pray quite a bit as an order. We pray 3-4 hours a day, but I said I'm going to do an extra half an hour of adoration every day. Because at the end of the day, I felt like we were a drop of water in a forest fire. And if God wouldn't show up, might as well close shop.
Nothing was going to happen anyways.
Nothing was going to happen anyway. One bishop told me, Father, we're in free fall and we don't know what to do. Another Episcopal vicar of another diocese here in this country told me, we've lost just schlagartig, which means in English, I guess, I don't know how you translate it, but just
hitting power. Yeah.
Just all at once. We've lost a whole generation. The young people, they're gone. They're just gone. anyway, and so I made that decision to pray more. That was good. And then actually somebody gave me a book, and it was from a Protestant who had his own leadership problems since then. I mean, it's actually, they've had a whole crisis. I'm probably heard of them, Willow Creek
Andy Stanley. Yeah.
No, not Andy Stanley's North Point in
Sorry.
Atlanta. It was Willow Creek was a guy called Bill Hybels, and
Right.
He's had his own abuse scandals. Anyway, and it was called Leading with Courage, and I read that book, and it really impressed me. And I said, and I looked into these people, and they were putting on this leadership conference for 60,000 people, community leaders, pastors, and I was thinking, I thought our charism is all about trying to form Christian leaders and for society, and like, what are these people doing? Just like, is there something we can learn from this? And then I started that started me on a journey, and I started just reading avidly books first of all, I ran into a lot of Protestants. So I ran into, you mentioned it, Andy Stanley, North Point. I ran into Saddleback in California.
Rick Warren. Yeah.
Rick Warren. I read a lot of their stuff. And then we started, our diocese, our cardinal has a friendship with the founder of HCB in London, which is an Anglican community, which
like
started the Alpha courses.
Yeah.
And so we started going to the leadership conference there in the Royal Albert Hall with some of our people, and started developing a friendship there. I started traveling, looking at different things. Then I started looking in the Catholic context. Ran into Divine Renovation, ran into Rebuilt in Baltimore, and Amazing Parish, and Weddell, and all these different things going on in the United States and Canada, and looked at a church in France that was quite having a lot of fruit, and just looking around. At the end of the day, I think I've read more than 40 books on leadership and organizational health and church growth, and in all sorts of different contexts, and like really looking outside the box. Also looking at the Protestants I was just mentioning, Church of the Redeemer in New York City. I thought that was quite interesting, some of the things they were doing. Tim Keller, Dynamics of Church Growth, Life Church, their leadership podcast, Craig Rochelle. Anyway, a lot of different things, and that period was like a 3-year period where I didn't stop doing everything we were doing here, but it wasn't planned to be like that. But that's basically what happened. It was a 3-year period of reorientation, of slowly developing a vision, or a vision that was starting to form in my mind. And then in the fall of 2015, there was a lot of things. Sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit. There was a lot of things that came together to make possible what we're doing today. And I would say it's providential. There was a lot of openness on the part of my superiors, because I was a bit concerned. I didn't want to, how shall I say?
You felt like you had this new vision and new way of doing things, and that might rock the boat because you were going to...
Right. I wasn't sure if everybody was going to say, hey, I'm being unfaithful to the charism and all this. But there was a lot of openness on the one hand, because this would not have been possible before the whole thing with the founder happened, because everything the founder did was considered like sacrosanct. You couldn't touch it, and especially the methodology. The fact that the whole thing happened with the founder made us question everything. And that was a good thing, like in a healthy way. Like, we didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, like to see, there was a long process of going through every number of our constitutions and seeing, what is founder, and like, what do we want to cut away? What is the value behind this number? What is maybe a charism that God is trying to tell us? So that was a long, long process, but we did question everything. And that willingness to question things, I'm really thankful for my superiors for allowing us, because there was still, even though there was a certain degree of openness, but people, like a lot of the things that we're doing elsewhere, we were continued with a lot of the methodology, and I'm not saying all of it is bad, it just wasn't working in our context. And so I was concerned about that. So they were my major superiors, the general director worldwide and my provincial, was just very supportive, like had my back. And he said, like, you can go ahead, you can try things. And that was helpful. And then on the other hand, our bishop, our Cardinal Schönborn, he was also very supportive. And so I'm part of his priest council now today. I'm in charge of the area of innovation, which doesn't mean a lot because priest council is very big. Like this is a very big diocese. We have over 600 parishes, and so the council is also very big. So you can't move a lot of things there. But just the fact that he's had me in there and I've given them talks on things that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, like us telling anybody about what to do with parishes, like, are you like insane? Like we wouldn't even think about it. But there's things have changed, and so one of the things that happened in 2010, there was this kind of pastoral process, kind of like a bishop synod, like a diocesan synod. That actually there was 3 of them over a period of 6 years. And one of the programmatic letters of the cardinal, right to the beginning, they had 6 points, and one of them was starting new communities. It is kind of hard to translate into English. It's called Gemeinde, which could mean a local community, but sometimes a local parish is also called a Gemeinde. So what the diocese did, they're trying to reduce these 600 and some parishes to 160. And within these mega parishes, you have Gemeinden, these communities, which could be a former parish, but they were also giving the opportunity to start new communities, which could be run either by the local parish or by an ecclesial location, like a religious order could start one of these things. And which would then be like quasi-parishes, which are not territorial, but rather milieu-specific, which again makes a lot of sense, especially in the way our cities work. So our cities don't work like North American cities. For example, like we don't have inner city poverty.
Right.
I'm shocked almost when I go to North American cities now and I see what happens in interior. We do have some poverty, but a lot of that is shipped in from outside, and some of them are gangs that are coming in from Eastern Europe. And like we have poverty, but it's more on the outskirts. On the inner city, it's where everything's happening. It's where the universities are. It's where like there's some very like you have maybe Manhattan. You have some of that. You'd have some of the like kind of also. Apartments, people that can afford it, they would live in the middle of the city. But even like where we are right now, we're about a 10-minute walk from St. Stephen's Cathedral. But there's a lot of young families with little kids living here. A lot of people live in apartments, not in houses here. But it's all upper middle class, and that's in the middle of the city. And this is where the young professionals are. This is where there's a lot of buzz happening in the middle of the city. It's where culture is happening. And so there's a lot of movement, and you have a very good metro system. Like even a lot of people in this middle of the city don't have a car because the metro system is so good, you can get anywhere, and a lot of times a lot faster than you could if you
and a culture of walking and all sorts of stuff like that,
and bicycles and things like that, right? So there's a lot of movement. And for example, I was parish council member of the cathedral many years, but not a single parish council member actually came from that geographical place. So there's a lot of movement, and that's why in the city context here, it makes sense for the church to rethink the whole parish thing. Like, is it always have to be just geographical, or could you be open to the idea? Now, I realize, and also obviously the local church realizes there's a canonical form of the local parish, and that's respected. But there's this openness to try new things, and we were just the first to do it. Like we didn't realize that's what we were actually doing. We started a quasi-parish trying to reach unchurched young people rather than territorial. There's now one other attempt in the diocese, which is very much promoted actually by the diocese itself, the Episcopal council, which is the closer council of the cardinal with some of his auxiliary bishops, the Episcopal vicar, 2 Episcopal vicars, and the general vicar. They're promoting this. He's a priest friend of ours actually, and we've supported him. And somebody who's came to faith here is now his right hand, his assistant, and that's kind of our first attempts at a little bit of church planting. But so there aren't a lot of these attempts, but there was this openness to try this new way of doing things, which makes a lot of sense here. And then let
me just take a step back for a second. I just want to, for the sake of our listeners, kind of maybe unpack some of everything that you've just said. In one sense, it's, and I really thank you for this, sharing your story and kind of seeing the hand of God in your life, in the circumstances that you've, by providence lived through and sort of trained you for, landing in the spot in Vienna. And then as, renewal starts, I see like a few sort of thematic elements that I feel like we can learn from as well. It's like, one is just, there was this act of courage to start saying, hey, an acknowledgement of what we are doing is not bearing the fruit that we desire within our hearts or feel even the Lord is maybe asking us to pursue. And then the other one would be, it feels like an amazing place of an environment of innovation, right? So many times, the risk of like letting go of the framework of Christendom in order to have this, in your words, like this pre-Constantine type environment where you're trying to reach all these pagan people requires sort of a letting go. And then the other thing that I find fascinating is what you're saying here is like this reordering of efforts, right? Like rethinking through like, can we have this, Gemeinde and, like kind of community of faith that has more of a directional effort as opposed to like a geographical boundary, even within the understanding. Maybe I'm hoping I understand all this right, but like you still have parish orientations there, but now there's a freedom for this to be another layer that can operate within the diocese, almost to say, hey, how can we concentrate our efforts on a particular problem? In your case, it being like reaching young people. But all of these things seem to be layering together almost by the hand of providence in your situation, to be able to think through how to have renewal in the context that you find yourself. Did I understand most of those things right? Do you want to expand on anything that I said there?
Yeah, I think it's well put. Maybe a couple of ideas. Our neighboring diocese is going from 500 and some parishes to 35. So nobody really knows how long the parish system is sustainable in just our context, because right now you have about 15,000 parishes in the German-speaking world. So Germany, northern Italy, parts of Switzerland and Austria, and it's crumbling away, right? So I think we have there's a window of opportunity to help. I'm a firm believer in the local church of communities. I think there's an incredible strength in that, but I think it's not. It goes without saying that you don't have to be a great prophet to see where we're going to be in 10 years, and a lot of these parish they're not going to be sustainable. So this idea, also going back to an idea of Pope Benedict, even like, you're going to have more of these kind of centers of faith which are growing and reaching out, and maybe we can go back to some of that. Like, maybe God can always do a miracle, right? And He has in the past. And there's been lots of examples in history where things have really come around, like France and beginning of the 1800s and the end of the 1800s. It's just incredible the turnaround it had. But just thinking humanly speaking, the parish model as it is right now, it's not going to be sustainable. It's dying. And so again, this is for somebody who loves the opportunity that a good parish is. And actually, one of the areas that we're investing in right now, we can go into that further on if you like. There's some of the areas because we have our parish community, but we're starting to develop other areas. And one of them we call a resource church, which is, we just did our first resource church conference about a month ago, helping other parishes how they could revitalize themselves. And we had parishes from Czech Republic, from Germany, from Austria coming. And so like our dream would be to have 2 or 3 or 4 like similar centers. They don't have to be part of our network. They don't have to be part of what we're doing, but like kind of these resource churches in each diocese that are modeling how to reach unchurched young people, capacitate them for missionary discipleship, and helping other church communities within their sphere of influence to do the same thing. That would be awesome. That would be our dream. And maybe, God can use some of this momentum that we are doing, that others are having, to kind of turn things around. But humanly speaking, like the Christendom thing is gone. So like how to like function in this society today, I think our diocese is not denying reality, and unfortunately, I think some other places are denying reality, and so there's a certain openness to try new things. And our cardinal is going into retirement this now in just a few months, so we don't know what's going to happen after that. But for the last 30 years, I mean, there's been a lot of openness towards innovation, and that's just been very encouraging and very helpful to be able to try new things. But until now, I mean, really, there are two attempts in this diocese to do something like this. Like it's us and this younger organization that are kind of behind still a bit what we're doing. They just started 4 years ago. So, and we're supporting them a little bit. But yeah, and it's a huge challenge. And at the same time, I think because our situation is so bad, it's forcing us to think in new ways and maybe be more, it's forcing us not to dream about bringing back something that's just not there anymore. And trying to be more realistic about like not trying to put wrong solutions to the problem.
When I think of like how the parish structure came in place, it's based off of like a lordship or a kingship model of like, hey, how far can a horse travel, or can somebody get physically to church, With the advent of like cars or, public transportation being as good as it is, a parish boundary is a beautiful way to organize yourself in locality. But in some ways, what I hear you saying is how we organize ourselves as a diocese and then as a structure within the diocese being able to like present efforts. There's some opportunity that you guys are, really at the forefront of saying, hey, like we've unshackled ourselves from certain things and done a beautiful job of remaining faithful to this sort of wisdom of the church's organization of herself, yet trying to apply that to the situation and the modern context that we find ourselves in. And I think everything that you're saying is fascinating. And the other line that you said was, your context is not denying reality. You're staring the truth of the situation right in the face, and almost alongside Jesus, willing to say, okay, well, what do we have to do here? And it sounds very apostolic era of, the early church, in being able to say, okay, like what's, where do we go? What do we do? How do we bring people to know Jesus?
I don't want to seem prideful or like come across that we know all the solutions. We don't, right? But I think what we're trying to do is, I mean, we make lots of mistakes. Actually, we're very humble that people come to we're a dinky little institution on top of a gas station, actually. Like it's not what you would think of your typical Viennese beautiful Baroque church where we're sitting inside of. And people come from all over the place to see this place. So that's humbling to see. But we also do realize that we do make lots of mistakes, and we're trying to learn from those mistakes. But one thing I did want to mention, I think that's so important that we are trying to learn, and that a lot of this has to come out of discernment, a spirit of discernment and real prayer. And so I just wanted to give something that kind of convicted us about, pretty much probably about 1 or 2 years into starting this. And we were in London with the HCP people and with our leadership team, and they were showing us around, very generous with their time with us. And I thought we had a great culture of prayer, and we would pray before our meetings and come Holy Spirit, fill our hearts faithful, and say a Hail Mary, and then start talking about things. And I mean, I'm praying more, and but we went there, and I mean, these people, like the Anglicans are doing a lot worse than Catholics as far as decline goes. But that particular parish started 60 new parishes. They started the Alpha course globally. They even hired one of our priests here to promote Alpha in Austria. I mean, paid better than the diocese. They're extremely generous with the time. They started this leadership conference every year with 5,000 people in the Royal Albert Hall, which is top notch. They have this leadership institute. I mean, they're doing all these things. And here you see the leadership team. They'll start a team meeting. It's not, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, now let's get to work. We're going to solve the problems of the world. But it's like, they'll be spending 5, 10, 15 minutes trying to listen to the Holy Spirit, like trying to share their impressions in prayer. You have the impression that decisions are made out of prayer. they come from prayer and are fostered by prayer. And it's just a different way of operation. Like, and we're far, from being perfect in that area. But I mean, there's so many, I could tell you stories about like some really major decisions that we've made that have just been so different because we've tried to make them come out of prayer. There's an idea from Rick Warren from one of his books. He's from California, so his metaphors are from surfing. And he says, you can look around for the good waves and try to learn how to surf them, but you can't create a wave. And for years, I had the impression we were trying to create a wave. I was trying to create a wave. I was telling God what he should be blessing, and instead of trying to figure out what is God blessing and how can we go along. Like for years, I was trying to get teenager work off the ground. And, just knocking my head against the wall and not realizing that God was blessing our work with university students. And it just took me forever to realize that maybe I should stop trying to make this thing with the teens work and start working with university students. And so we don't want to make that mistake constantly. And we're trying to, now got lots of teenagers, but again, like in hindsight, but it was just, this trying to figure out like, where is God blessing something and where is he leading us to? And where is he creating waves and how can we go along? For example, the area of the resource church, I think it might even be a charism of this place because I think we make lots of mistakes. And nevertheless, we've been able to bless a lot of other parishes and help them in their work in a way which for me is disproportionate to who we are, but just because God is using us in that way, like, or even our weaknesses. And I'm mentioning that also because I think in a Christendom model, you didn't have to do that so much. You had to do it especially on a personal level. Like you were discerning spirits because it was your personal walk with God. But, for hundreds of years in this country, the parish priest didn't have to discern a lot. Like he just had to make sure the system was working. Like just keep filling the system, which had been working for hundreds of years. Why shouldn't it work tomorrow? When I got here, there was a congregation of priests, a local congregation. They were the non plus ultra of youth work. They were incredible. They were getting all these kids together. 10 years later, you hardly hear about them anymore. 10 years, like that's nothing in time, right? And I'm not like there's that the answer why they just lost relevance is complex, but I think one of the dangers that we have as a church is, we have a vision and then we put in strategies how to get there and methodologies, but for some reason with time, those methodologies and strategies become the vision. Like we've always done it this way and we can always do it this way in the future. We as a congregation had the same problem. In the 90s, our youth work methodology was working great, but today it doesn't work at all. This is an idea from Andy Stanley. Marry your vision, date your model. Like, you've got to hold loosely your methodology. And this is also an idea from Pope Francis, like from Evangelium Gaudium, when he talks about this idea of time is more important than space. We tend to create these spaces of security where we feel safe, and it's understandable. I know how this youth work works. I've been doing it for years. And it can be very scary to kind of say, let's stop doing this and do something different because this is no longer working. And to admit that to yourself. And so that needs, I think, a lot of prayer and a lot of discernment, a lot of honesty with ourselves, and also trust in God that, like, if he's leading us somewhere, he's gonna lead us somewhere. And, but it takes that courage, I think, to kind of step out and say, let's leave our ways of doing things. So I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of principles that we've been learning. For example, when a church comes here, a parish from the boondocks of Austria, somewhere in the mountains, and they come here with their parish team, and we say, like, don't copy paste what you see here. Please don't copy paste. This is something I try to also explain when in the possible American benefactors, when I come to the United States here, because they're always about, okay, what's your model? How do you scale it? Like, is this scalable? And then I said, I don't want our model to be scaled. I want the principles to be scaled. But don't try to copy paste what we're doing, because it's not going to work in your context. But But I think there's certain principles that we've been learning, and that's one of them. And this is also, I think, the genius of a true synodality, like using. I remember the cardinal came back from the synod in Rome, and he was telling our priest council about this, like the difference between the German synodal path and the Roman synodal path, which is like very much based on prayer and like discernment and trying to figure out. And you know, it's a beautiful thing because its method is you sit around in the room and everybody kind of shares their opinion, and then instead of talking that person down, you explain what that has done with you in your interior. Like it's discernment of spirits. Did that give me peace? Did it make me, did it cause anxiety? Like, and then you share what the other person did in the room. And that obviously needs a lot of maturity, spiritual maturity on the part of people taking place, that you're not trying to, be lobbyists of your personal opinions. But that thing of discernment is so important, I think, for churches today, much more so than in the past. For the reason I've been speaking.
Yeah. So, man, there's so much that you're sharing in the last little bit that we have here together. Have you you've got these principles that you've put together, and if prayer and not just trying to copy and implement a model as if it was a franchise, but like having some sense of discernment of a context and what we feel the Lord is doing, and what waves is the Lord bringing about in our space and time that we find ourselves in. What are some of maybe the other principles that as you look to particularly us here in North America, like what are some principles, and I'm assuming they're universal, but what do you see here that you would be willing to share with us? And I totally understand this is coming from a place of humility and things like that, where I'd love to hear more of those principles, if possible.
Well, some of the things we've learned from you, like one of them is, for example, belonging before believing. This is also Pope Francis, so talking about the kerygma. You start with the kerygma, then you go to catechism, and then you go to morals, instead of the other way around. First morals, then catechism, then kerygma. Kind of the same idea, but like the way that you approach things. So before you can even get to the kerygma, like people need to realize that they're loved, and so we try to express that even architectonically. So in order to get into our church space, you have to go through this kind of living room atmosphere. And this new church that we're building, the building that we're having is just it's a lot bigger than what we have now, because we're experiencing expansion. The Lord has been really good to us. And so we're building kind of a Catholic Starbucks, and you have to go through that to get into our church space. Why? Because we're focused on unchurched people. And so we realize a lot of people, they'll get stuck 1, 2, 3 hours after Mass. But I was mentioning to you before, our local Gothic church is a refrigerator in the winter, and the local parish hall is 5 streets down. You lose everybody after Mass. Like, nobody sticks around. So that's an example of something, actually a principle we've learned from you. Another thing that maybe might be interesting, one of them, this is an idea from Romano Guardini. It's a long German word, Spannungseinheit, and it means something like unity in tension. And so it's similar to an idea from Andy Stanley and the correlative values. So if you just think about the work, or if you're just doing work, you're going to lose your family. If you're just concerned about the family, you're going to lose your work. So that's not a problem you want to solve. It's a tension you want to uphold. And there's a lot of that in Catholicism, right? Like, Jesus is God and he's man. He's lion, he's king, but he's our friend. He's transcendent, but he's super close. And so you have all these tensions. Bishop Barron in his Paradoxes book talks about that as well. And one of those unity intentions we see that is about tradition and modernity. And so I look at the States and I do see a certain degree of polarization, also within the church. Like, it's just the Latin Mass, or it's super liberal sometimes, or whatever. And I have nothing against the Latin Mass. Like, I have had some experience in that tradition myself, my own faith journey. As long as it's not like this is the only way to do things. And as long as well, I don't want to talk about the Latin Mass, but I just want to talk about there's sometimes kind of this, if we could just bring back the church from 60 years ago, everything is going to be fine. And I think that's not Catholic. It's just like, but one of the things that really inspires me are the Jesuits 600 years ago in southern Germany, and in this country, in Austria. There was a Protestant Reformation. And what did they do? They had also, there was this dark kind of Calvinism, especially in Switzerland, like stripping the churches, making them black, no statues, no alcohol, no coffee. Like it was just kind of this. And what did they do? They took the Gothic churches and they turned them into Baroque ones, and they turned secular music, which was Baroque, and they gave it a twist and gave it Catholic like texts to secular music, but the tunes were secular Baroque music. You turned the Gothic chasubles into Baroque ones. You turned the chalices at Mass into Baroque ones. It must have been an incredible aesthetic experience for the people of the time to see how like this unity of all these different things, like of one not genre, but I don't know what you want to call it, but like it was this Baroque thing, and it was super contemporary. And today we look back and we say, oh, the priest is wearing that vestment, which is actually used to be super contemporary vestment, which is a lot newer than the Gothic ones that we're using again after the Second Vatican Council in a lot of places, which were older, and this music, which is called, this is traditional Catholic music. It was super contemporary like music, and it was just so that's kind of funny for me, almost like to see that, but also sad a little bit, because like church and art has been going like this for 500 years. What would it mean today for us to have a Catholic revival inside this culture? And obviously that means preserving tradition. The Jesuits didn't throw out all of Gothic churches. They didn't like forbid singing Gregorian chant. We want to preserve that tradition. It's important that there are places where that's happening, but we definitely also need an engagement with the society of today and figure out, how does the gospel penetrate that? Like engaging with secular culture, I think is messy. I'll give you another example. We have one of our young, like we really focus on the weekend. So we have our masses. We could talk ages about that. We've actually, this is almost a heresy. I don't want to say this too loud, but we've stopped doing one of our alpha courses for a while. We might start them again, but right now we're getting tons more people coming in through the weekend masses than we were getting through alpha. And not just our context, for different reasons. Actually, we help other churches start alpha, so we're not against alpha. All I'm saying is, like, there's the Gen Zers here in our context. A lot of times they're looking increasingly more for relevant experiences and not just answers to their questions, even though they're obviously also looking for answers to their questions. But like so
just to unpack what you were saying and ask you a question, like, in many contexts, we're trying to convince people to do alpha, and you're saying, oh, we're not anti-alpha, but we want to go to more relevant experiences, which you guys have set yourself up for in that context, and Mass in your particular context is actually providing that gateway into the mystical. Or how did you guys kind of get to that decision? Just to unpack the nuance of it, if that makes sense.
So there's a lot of different types of alpha course. So we continue to do the youth course. We have the marriage course. We have online courses. We've done alpha for ex-prison convicts. We've had tons of alpha courses here, but the normal alpha courses for young adults right now is not working for us. And so there's we could talk ages about that, but also other activities. Alpha is 10 evenings and a weekend. Not even Alpha Central, like London, does the weekend anymore. They just do days, because it's so difficult. Like the typical young person on Friday at 6 p.m., he doesn't yet know what he's going to be doing at 8 p.m. Never mind for the next 10 weeks. And so these formats, which are very long, we've been trying to figure out like smaller formats, more. For example, we have something called the Leadership Development Academy, and we used to have it. It was a program of 2 years, and you'd sign up, and that just doesn't work. And so we define leadership around 5 principles, and we have these one standoff activities, which are either seminars or even whole day activities. Each one of these is around one of these 5 principles. The people don't even know it, but they're not signing up for like doing, I'm going to sign up for the next half year for this program. But if you keep coming back to one of these activities, you'll be trained in all these 5 areas. And usually those activities are sold out within hours of us even putting them online. But anything which has to do with, for the next 10 evenings, the next 10 weeks, right, that's become more difficult.
Getting that commitment is way harder, but you feel like you can engage them more on an ongoing basis by saying, right. And of course that actually requires massive amounts of more intentionality. It's easy to say, here's the program, I got it set up, but just take a step back and say, here's 5 principles that we think would be, and I assume they're like formation unto something. The 5 principles are formation ends in and of themselves. I'm super curious as to how you guys have, what the 5 are.
There's obviously different models on leadership, right? We like the leadership challenge idea, so that's very simple because people tend to get it quickly and easily. So it's inspire common vision, lead the way, inspire common vision, challenge the process, encourage, enable to act, and encourage the heart. Those are the 5 things. And it's also a process, but it's also like if you do those things, 5 things well, and there's certain things within that, like ways of acting within each of those that help you to get to those things. But that we try to train our people, our ministry leaders, etc., using that concept, and they get it quite well easily. So you could do a bit more complex, etc.
Sure.
But now one of the things is we used to have this activity called, it was kind of like theology on tap in North America. We changed it a little bit, and we started this before we started the center actually, and we had hundreds of people come. And it was great. But after some years, first of all, that was one of the learnings. It's not about programs, it's about the people, and it's about helping. You've got to figure out how to move people from, like, if you have the unchurched person here and the saint over here, like, how do you get from A to B? And that's what you have to figure out as a community. And so to just have standoff activities that aren't connected to each other and you don't have a process, that's not very helpful. That's what theology on tap was for a while for us before we started this whole concept, before we even realized you have to think more in steps rather than in programs, which is another non-Christendom way of doing things. Because before, you could, like the local parish priest, you could just do different activities because everything else in society was socializing you and making you more Christian Catholic. Now you have to think much more intentionally in steps. And that's why I think the local community continues in whatever form that is, if it's a parish or whatever. But it's such an awesome place where that can happen, because one program itself is not going to do it. You need to have a place where people can grow and be taking steps. Like what I wanted to say about theology on tap, there was a moment when we realized, okay, if we've done this for 8-9 years. We had 5 volunteers that were just barely helping with it. And all of a sudden we had 40 volunteers for Alpha. And we were getting a lot more results with Alpha than with theology on tap. And so now we're at a point where we're saying, we took a long time to discern this in our context, like 2 years. Is it because we're doing Alpha bad, or is it because maybe something similar is happening, like theology on tap for us, that it's just run its course in our context? Like it needs something new. It's everybody's done it in our community, so it's hard to invite somebody if you're not going there yourself. It's you need other ways of doing things. So we don't want to have any holy cows, like, so to speak, that we're not willing to offer it's because it's about division. It's not about the program. And even something so awesome as Alpha it can be a really awesome program. And maybe that's precisely what a local church might need right now. But I'm just saying you have to one needs to be willing to discern. But you asked me about the principle of unity and tension. I just wanted to briefly tell this one story. So we focus a lot on the weekend, but on the weekday mass, we have a girl here that's super evangelistic. And so she grabbed somebody off the street, and he came to weekday mass, and where we do nothing really. It's more for the insider. It's not for the people that we're trying to reach. And anyway, after mass, he was dressed really weird. It turns out he's a homosexual prostitute working in the streets of Vienna, and kind of complaining because Zurich is working better for him than Vienna. And so you've got this super pious lady, like, and he's talking to us after mass, and like, what are your reactions? Like, how do you deal with that? And to realize, okay, God loves this person. He doesn't love his lifestyle, but like, what I'm saying is the unity in tension. Like, a lot of times there was after one of our youth masses, there was this huge discussion that happened because one of our pious, good, wonderful young Catholic ladies, she was kind of scandalized because somebody else was there who was for abortion. And I pulled her aside afterwards and I said, I understand you, like, I'm with you, but I wish there were a lot more people coming here who are for abortion, because like, we're trying to reach the unchurched, and they're going to think differently than us. If 2 years later they're still for abortion, we've got a problem. We say we want to fish, but we don't like their smell. Like, we don't like how they look like, how they dress, how they talk, what they think about. And we have to learn to love the fish, not their lifestyle necessarily, and not what's sin and but we have to know how to love them, right? And that's been like, this sounds so banal and so simple, but it's one of the most difficult things to do. That we try to model and try to talk a lot about our team and say, we have to really love the people that walk through our doors. And I mean, like, really love them and be wide open in our arms and embrace them and so belonging before believing. But that creates a unity, and like, there's a tension there, obviously, because you're inviting these people to take steps, but everybody has their own time. Like, if you have a whole bunch of baby Christians in your church, for somebody who's been there a long time, and just, it can create even like almost I don't want these people, and like they're bad influence on me and maybe on those around me. And I said, well, isn't that what we're here for? Is to try to reach the lost? Jesus, so it's we could talk a lot about that.
And I'm so sad that our time is running out. I would love to have you on again, because I feel like there is so much more wisdom and experience that you've had that we can translate. But we've run out of time, and I know you got a hard stop going to your next meeting. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to say goodbye. But I really want to thank you. Your story is inspiring to me, and I'm sure it's inspiring to a lot of other people. And the discernment that you guys have done and the place that you're in really does bless many people. And I feel like there's a lot of truth and nuggets that you have shared with us that I would encourage everyone to kind of take through and think through where these things are maybe not being upheld or haven't been thought of enough in our context. So thank you again for being on the show. And I would absolutely love to have you back to continue the conversation.
Thanks for having me. Okay, God bless.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.